Continuing Pompey from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. In the same term and style of imperator, which might well cause surprise, as none could have ever anticipated that he would have imparted to one so young in years, and not yet a senator, a title which was the object of contention between him and Scipios and Marii, and indeed all the rest of his department, was agreeable to this first compliment. Whenever Pompey came into his presence, he paid some sort of respect to him, either in rising and being uncovered, or the like, which he was rarely seen to do with anyone else, notwithstanding that there were many about him of great rank and honor. Of course, in most cultures, I think that would be a sign of disrespect, but yet Pompey was not puffed up at all, or exalted with these favors, and when Sulla would have sent him with all expedition into Gaul, a province in which it was thought Metellus, who commanded in it, had done nothing wrong, of the large forces at his disposal, Pompey urged that it could not be fair or honorable for him to take a province out of the hands of his senior in command and his superior in reputation. However, if Metellus were willing, and should request his service, he should be very ready to accompany and assist him in the war. Which, when Metellus came to understand, he approved of the proposal and invited him over by letter. On this, Pompey fell immediately into Gaul, where he not only achieved wonderful exploits of himself, but also fired up and kindled again that bold and warlike spirit which old age had in a manner extinguished in Metellus into a new heat, just as molten copper, they say, when poured upon that which is cold and solid, will dissolve and melt it faster than fire itself. But as when a famous wrestler has gained the first place among men, and borne away the prizes at all the games, it is not usual to take account of his victories as a boy, or to enter them upon record among the rest. So with the exploits of Pompey in his youth, though they were extraordinary in themselves, yet because they were obscured and buried in the multitude, and greatest of his latter wars and conquests, I dare not be particular in them, lest, by trifling away time in the lesser moments of his youth, we should be driven to omit those greater actions and fortunes which best illustrate his character. Now when Sulla had brought all Italy under his dominion, and was proclaimed dictator, he began to reward the rest of his followers by giving freely and without restriction any favors that they asked for. But as for Pompey, admiring his valor and conduct, and thinking that he might prove a great stay and support to him hereafter in his affairs, he sought means to attach to himself by some personal alliance, and his wife Metella joining in his wishes, they too persuaded Pompey to put away Antistia and marry Aemilia, the stepdaughter of Sulla, born by Metella to Scaurus, her former husband, she being at that very time the wife of another man living with him and with child by him. These were the very tyrannies of marriage, and much more agreeable to the times under Sulla than to the nature and habits of Pompey, that Aemilia, great with child, should be, as it were, ravished from the embraces of another for him, and that Antistia should be divorced with dishonor and misery by him, for whose sake she had been but just before bereft of her father, for Antistius was murdered in the Senate, because he was suspected to be a favorer of Sulla for Pompey's sake, and her mother likewise, after she had seen all these indignities, made away with herself, a new calamity to be added to the tragic accompaniments of this marriage, and that there might be nothing wanting to complete them. Aemilia herself died almost immediately after entering Pompey's house in childhood. About this time, news came to Sulla that Perpenna was fortifying himself in Sicily, that the island was now becoming a refuge and receptacle for the relics of the adverse party, that Carbo was hovering about those seas with the navy, and Domitius had fallen in upon Africa, and that many of the exiled men of note who had escaped from the proscriptions were daily flocking into those parts. Against these, therefore, Pompey was sent with a large force, and no sooner was he arrived in Sicily, but Perpenna immediately departed, leaving the whole island to him. Pompey received the distressed cities into favor, and treated all with great humanity except the Mamertines in Messina, for when they protested against his court and jurisdiction, alleging their privilege and exemption founded upon an ancient charter or grant of the Romans, he replied sharply, "What? Will you never cease prating of laws to us that have swords by our sides?" It was thought likewise that he showed some inhumanity to Carbo, seeming rather to insult over his misfortunes than to chastise his crimes, for if there had been a necessity, as perhaps there was, that he should be taken off, that might have been done at first, as soon as he was taken prisoner, for it would have been the act of him that commanded it. But here Pompey commanded a man that had been thrice consul of Rome to be brought in fetters to stand at the bar, he himself sitting upon the bench in judgment, examining the cause with the formalities of law, to the offense and indignation of all that were present, and afterwards order him to be taken away and put to death, is related by way of Carbo, that as soon as he was brought to the place and saw the sword for execution, he was suddenly seized with a looseness or pain in his bowels, and desired a little respite of the executioner. What's wrong with being executed at that time? And a convenient place to relieve himself. And yet further, Appius, the friend of Caesar, tells us that Pompey dealt cruelly with Quintus Valerius, a man of singular learning and science, for when he was brought to him, he walked aside and drew him into conversation. After putting a variety of questions to him and receiving answers from him, he ordered his officers to take away and put him to death. Well, I guess you might say, "Oh, I feel even more embarrassed when I die. I'm going to let loose even more than." It's like, well, a lot of people don't know until they feel the urge, right? But it's like, yeah, just you're gonna be executed. You're gonna be executed. Why not leave them more of a mess to clean up after? I understand the dignity of the whole thing, but but we must not be too credulous in the case of narratives told by Appius, especially when he undertakes to relate anything touching the friends or foes of Caesar. This is certainly that there lay a necessity upon Pompey to be severe upon many of Sulla's enemies, those at least that were eminent persons in themselves and notoriously to be taken. As for the rest, he acted with all clemency possible for him, conniving at the concealment of some, and himself being the instrument of the escape of others. Rumbling and tumbling quite a bit. So in the case of the Himeraeans, for when Pompey had determined on severely punishing their city, as they had been abettors of the enemy, Sosthenes, the leader of the people there, craving liberty of speech, told him that when he was about to do what he was about to do was not at all consistent with justice, for that he would pass by the guilty and destroy the innocent, and on Pompey demanding who that guilty person was, that would assume the offenses of them all. Sosthenes replied it was himself who had engaged his friends by persuasion to what they had done, and his enemies by force, whereupon Pompey, being much taken with the frank speech and noble spirit of the man, first forgave his crime, and then pardoned all the rest of the Himeraeans. Hearing likewise that the soldiers were very disorderly in their march, doing violence upon the roads, he ordered their swords to be sealed up in their scabbards, and whosoever kept them not so were severely punished. Whilst Pompey was thus busy in the affairs of the government of Sicily, he received a decree of the Senate and a commission from Sulla, commanding him forthwith to sail into Africa and make war upon Domitius with all his forces, for Domitius had rallied up a far greater army than Marius had not long since, when he sailed out of Africa into Italy and caused a revolution in Rome, and himself, of a fugitive outlaw, became a tyrant. Pompey, therefore, having prepared everything with the utmost speed, left Ammius, his sister's husband, governor of Sicily, and set sail with 120 galleys and 800 other vessels laden with provisions, money, ammunition, and engines of battery. He arrived with his fleet, part at the port of Utica, part at Carthage, and no sooner was he landed, but 7,000 of the enemy revolted and came over to him, while his own forces that he brought with him consisted of 6 entire legions. Here they tell us of a pleasant incident that happened to him at his first arrival, and of course I'm trying to give it more of a Greek or even at least a Latin pronunciation, right? Which means that the G is not said in the Carthage, not Carthage, Carthage. You don't say it as a J. It's hundreds of years till people started doing that with their G's. Some of his soldiers, having by accident stumbled upon a treasure, by which they got a good sum of money, the rest of the army, hearing this, began to fancy that the field was full of gold and silver, which had been hid there of old by the Carthaginians in the time of their calamities, and thereupon fell to work, so that the army was useless to Pompey for many days, being totally engaged in the digging for the fancied treasure, he himself all the while waking up and down only, and laughing to see so many thousands together, digging and turning up the earth, until at last, growing weary and hopeless, they came to themselves, and returned to their general, begging him to lead them where he pleased, for that they had already revised the punishment of their folly. By this time, Domitius had prepared himself and drawn out his army in array against Pompey, but there was a watercourse betwixt them, craggy and difficult to pass over, and this, together with a great storm of wind and rain pouring down even from the break of day, seemed to leave but little possibility of their coming together, so that Domitius, not expecting any engagement that day, commanded his forces to draw off and retire to the camp, Now Pompey, who was watchful upon every occasion, making use of the opportunity, ordered a march forthwith, and, having passed over the torrent, fell in immediately upon their quarters. The enemy was in great disorder and tumult, and in that confusion attempted a resistance, but they neither were all there, nor supported one another. Besides, the wind having veered about, beat the rain full in their faces. Neither indeed was the storm less troublesome to the Romans, for that they could not clearly discern one another, insomuch that even Pompey himself, being unknown, escaped narrowly. For when one of his soldiers demanded of him the word of battle, it happened that he was somewhat slow in his answer, which might have cost him his life, the enemy being routed with a great slaughter. For it is said that of 20,000 there escaped but 3,000. The army saluted Pompey by the name of Imperator, but he declined it, telling them that he could not by any means accept of that title as long as he saw the camp of the enemy standing, but if they designed to make him worthy of the honor, they must first demolish that. The soldiers, on hearing this, went at first and made an assault upon the works and trenches, and there Pompey fought, without his helmet, in memory of his former danger. Well, and to avoid the like. Well, he's bringing about more danger, right? The camp was thus taken by storm, and among the rest, Domitius was slain. After that overthrow, the cities of the country thereabouts were all either secured by surrender or taken by storm. King Iarbas, likewise, a confederate and auxiliary of Domitius, was taken prisoner, and his kingdom was given to Hiempsal. Pompey could not rest here, but being ambitious to follow the good fortune and use valor of his army, entered Numidia, and, marching forward many days' journey up into the country, he conquered all wherever he came, and having revived the terror of the Roman power, which was now almost obliterated amongst the barbarous nations, they just mean they don't understand their language. He said, likewise, that the wild beasts of Africa ought not to be left without some experience of the courage and success of the Romans, and therefore he bestowed some few days in hunting lions and elephants, and it is said that it was not above the space of 40 days at the utmost in which he gave a total overthrow to the enemy, reduced Africa, and established the affairs of the kings and kingdoms of all that country, being then in the 24th year of his age. Of course, they don't mean the whole continent, but when Pompey returned back to the city of Attica, there were presented to him letters and orders from Sulla, commanding him to disband the rest of his army, and himself with 1 legion only to wait there for the coming of another general to succeed him in the government. This inwardly was extremely grievous to Pompey, though he made no show of it, but the army resented it openly, and when Pompey besought them to depart and go home before him, they began to revile Sulla, and declared broadly that they were resolved not to forsake him, neither did they think it safe for him to trust the tyrant. Pompey at first endeavored to appease and pacify them by fair speeches, but when he saw that his persuasions were vain, he left the bench and retired to his tent with tears in his eyes. But the soldiers followed him, and seizing upon him by force, brought him again and placed him in his tribunal, where great part of that day was spent in dispute, they on their part persuading him to stay and command them, on the other side pressing upon them obedience and the danger of mutiny. At last, when they grew yet more importunate and clamorous, he swore that he would kill himself if they attempted to force him and scarcely even thus appeased them. Nevertheless, the first tidings brought to Sulla were that Pompey was up in rebellion, on which he remarked to some of his old friends, I see then it is my destiny to contend with children in my old age, alluding at the same time to Marius, who, being but a mere youth, had given him great trouble, and brought him into extreme danger, but being undeceived afterwards by better intelligence, and finding the whole city prepared to meet Pompey and receive him with every display of kindness and honor, he resolved to exceed them all, and therefore, going out foremost to meet him, and embracing him with great cordiality, he gave him his welcome aloud, in the title of Magnus, or the Great, and bade all that were present call him by that name. Others say that he had this title first given him by a general acclamation of all the army in Africa. But that it was fixed upon him by this ratification of Sulla. It is certain that he himself was the last that owned the title, for it was a long time after, when he was sent proconsul at Spain against Sertorius, that he began to write himself in his letters and commissions by the name of Pompeius Magnus, common and familiar use having then worn off the invidiousness of the title, and one cannot but accord respect and admiration to the ancient Romans, who did not reward the successes of action and conduct in war alone with such honorable titles, but adorned likewise the virtue and services of eminent men in civil government with the same distinctions and marks of honor. Two persons received from the people the name of Maximus, or the greatest, Valerius, for reconciling the Senate and people, and Fabius Rullus, because he put out of the Senate certain sons of freed slaves who had been admitted into it, and because of their wealth. Pompey now desired the honor of a triumph, which Sulla opposed, alleging that the law allowed that honor to none but consuls and praetors, and therefore Scipio the elder, who subdued the Carthaginians in Spain in far greater and nobler conflicts, never petitioned for a triumph, because he had never been consul or praetor at a Pompey, who had scarcely yet fully grown a beard, and was not of age to be a senator, should enter the city in triumph. What a weight of envy it would bring, he said, at once upon his government and Pompey's honor. This was his language to Pompey, intimating that he could not by any means yield to his request, but if he would persist in his ambition, that he was resolved to interpose his power to humble him. Pompey, however, was not daunted, but bade Sulla recollect that more worshipped the rising than the setting sun, as if to tell him that his power was increasing and Sulla's in the wane. Sulla did not perfectly hear the words, but observing a sort of amazement and wonder in the looks and gestures of those that did hear them, he asked what it was that he said. When it was told him, he seemed astounded at Pompey's boldness, and cried out twice together, "Let him triumph!" And when others began to show their disapprobation and offense at it, Pompey, it is said, to gall and vex them the more, designed to have his triumphant chariot drawn with 4 elephants, having brought over several which belonged to the African kings. But the gates of the city being too narrow, he was forced to desist from that project, and be content with horses. And when his soldiers, who had not received as large rewards as they had expected, began to clamor and interrupt the triumph, Pompey regarded these as little as the rest, and plainly told them that he had rather lose the honor of his triumph than flatter them, upon which Servilius a man of great distinction, and at first one of the chief opposers of Pompey's triumph, said he now perceived that Pompey was truly great and worthy of a triumph. It is clear that he might easily have been a senator also if he had wished, but he did not sue for that, being ambitious, it seems, only of unusual honors. For what wonder had it been for Pompey to sit in the Senate before his time, but to triumph before he was in the Senate was really an excess of glory. And moreover, it did not a little ingratiate him with the people, who were much pleased to see him after his triumph take his place again among the Roman knights. On the other side, it was no less distasteful to Sulla to see how fast he came on, as to what a height of glory and power he was advancing, yet being ashamed to hinder him, he kept quiet. But when, against his direct wishes, Pompey got Lepidus made consul, having openly joined in the canvass, and, by the goodwill the people felt for himself, conciliated their favor for Lepidus, Sulla could forbear no longer, but when he saw him coming away from the election through the forum, with a great train after him, cried out to him, "Well, young man, I see you rejoice in your victory, and indeed, is it not a most generous and worthy act that the consulship should be given to Lepidus, the vilest of men, in preference to Catullus, the best and most deserving in the city, and all by your influence with the people? It will be well, however, for you to be wakeful and look to your interest, as you have been making your enemy stronger than yourself." But that which gave the clearest demonstration of Sulla's ill will to Pompey was his last will and testament, for whereas he had bequeathed several legacies to all the rest of his friends and appointed some of them guardians to his son, he passed by Pompey without the least remembrance. However, Pompey bore this with great moderation and temper. When Lepidus and others were disposed to obstruct his interment in the Campus Martius, and to prevent any public funeral taking place, came forward in support of it, and saw his obsequies performed with all honor and security. Shortly after the death of Sulla, his prophetic words were fulfilled, and Lepidus, proposing to be the successor to all his power and authority, without any ambiguities or pretenses, immediately appeared in arms, rousing once more and gathering about him all the long dangerous remains of the old factions which had escaped the hand of Sulla. Catullus, his colleague, who was followed by the sounder part of the Senate and people, was a man of the greatest esteem among the Romans, for wisdom and justice, but his talent lay in the government of the city rather than the camp, whereas the exigency required the skill of Pompey. Pompey, therefore, was not long in suspense which way to dispose of himself, but joining with the nobility, was presently appointed general of the army against Lepidus, who had already raised up a war in great part of Italy, and held Cisalpine Gaul in subjection with an army under Brutus. As for the rest of his garrisons, Pompey subdued them with ease in his march, but Mutina in Gaul resisted in a former siege, and lay here a long time encamped against Brutus. In the meantime, Lepidus marched in all haste against Rome, and sitting down before it with a crowd of followers, to the terror of those within, demanded a second consulship. But that fear quickly vanished upon letters sent from Pompey, announcing that he had ended the war without a battle, for Brutus, either betraying his army or being betrayed by the revolt, surrendered himself to Pompey, and receiving a guard of horse, was conducted to a little town upon the river Po. not the Chinese one, where he was slain the next day by Gymnias. An execution of Pompey's commands, and for this Pompey was much censured for having at the beginning of the revolt written to the Senate that Brutus had voluntarily surrendered himself. Immediately afterward he sent other letters with matter of accusation against the man after he was taken off. Brutus, who with Cassius slew Casar, was son to this Brutus, neither in the war nor in his death, like his father, as appears at large in his life, but Lepidus, upon being driven out of Italy, fled to Sardinia, where he fell sick and died of sorrow, not for his public misfortunes, as they say, but upon the discovery of a letter proving his wife to have been unfaithful to him. There yet remained Sertorius, a very different general from Lepidus, in possession of Spain, and making himself formidable to Rome, the final disease, as it were, in which the scattered evils of the civil wars had now collected. He had already cut off various inferior commanders, and was at this time coping with Metellus Pius, a man of repute and a good soldier, though perhaps he might now seem too slow by reason of his age to second and improve the happier moments of war, and might be sometimes wanting to those advantages which Sertorius by his quickness and dexterity would wrest out of his hands, for Sertorius was always hovering about and coming upon him unawares, like a captain of thieves rather than soldiers, disturbing him perpetually with ambuscades and light skirmishes, where Metellus was accustomed to regular conduct and fighting in battle array with full armed soldiers.